We'll wait for the... Now it's on, right? Hello. Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. I was a bit worried that too many people might be on vacation or whatever, but this is not a normal seminar, so it's going to be a dialogue or a conversation that Peter and I would like to have, and not just with each other, but I will occasionally look up, and anytime any of you want to jump in with a question or a comment or whatever, feel free to do that. I will try to do this in a very interactive manner. I want to start by explaining how it came to this discussion today, because sometimes these things just happen and you don't plan for them. So I can't remember exactly when. It must have been a couple of years ago now. I was driving to Norswick in my car, and on the way was listening to BBC Radio 4 Desert Island, having a conversation with Peter about his life and the work he did on Ebola and AIDS and whatever else it was, And in this conversation, of course, his book was mentioned, No Time to Lose, A Life in Pursuit of Deadly Viruses, in which he captures many of these experiences. And so after listening to this for an hour, I immediately went and bought the book. Great. And then it ended up on my bookshelf, where there was a long row of 30 other books that I wanted to read. So it got a little bit neglected for a couple of years, I think. And then my daughter picked it up and read it. And then she came to me and said, "You need to read this book, because it's really good and very inspiring." And so I read it, And I read it fairly quickly, because it is actually, it almost reads like an adventure type of novel. But it's not fiction, it's actually facts or non-fiction. And I felt that when I read this, I said, well, even though at a somewhat lower level and in a different world, I had experienced kind of similar things, in my life and scientific career and environment that we work with here. So I wrote to Peter and said, look, I've really enjoyed this reading, and I feel there's a lot of commonalities between the work we do and that you people do in the human health area, trying to fight some of the big global challenges, and sometimes winning a little battle, sometimes not quite winning it yet, or sometimes even failing. So, and then I said, it would be nice to have you here for a visit. And by the way, we have some collaboration with the London School of Tropical Medicine, Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I always get it wrong. Nice. So it would be good to talk about this too, and that's how it came about it. So, of course, I need to give you at least a basic introduction of Peter's life, although I've sent this around, and so some of you, as always, of course, have ignored reading those emails or following up on things. So I need to just point out a few things, But I'm guessing we'll come back to a number of those. So Peter was born in Belgium, and then studied medicine and earned his MD degree in 1974, and then he began working at the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp, and went on to do a degree in clinical microbiology, and received a PhD in microbiology in Antwerp in 1980. But, and that's, I think, a message for the students here, in 1976, while he was still at the very early stages, I think, of your PhD even, he was a part of the team that discovered the Ebola virus. And then very quickly disappeared into the jungle for quite some time. And helped identifying the sources of it, and contributed to stopping that first Ebola outbreak within 3 months after it had killed 200 people. So how many PhD students get to do something like this nowadays? Hands up. All right, look for the opportunity. So how did you get, as a first question maybe, how did you get into Ebola? Was it just by pure luck? Did somebody tell you to do it, or?
Oh, it's luck. A combination of luck, in the sense that a pilot from Sabena, an airline that doesn't exist anymore, but flew from Kinshasa, the capital of what was then called Zaire, to Belgium, with a shiny blue thermos, that you use for coffee or tea or something like that. And in it were swimming a bit of ice cubes and 2 glass vials. And for the younger generation, there was a time that all lab materials was in glass. There's no plastic. And there was a small note with it from a physician in Kinshasa. This contains blood from was a Flemish nun, a missionary, who had died with something they didn't know what it was, and but it could be yellow fever, something, and a viral infection that we were qualified to diagnose. And so the question was, can you figure out what this is? And in these days, for those of you who are into microbiology, and others, isolating a virus was more like cooking. And I like to cook, so that was okay. So you put the sample on the cell line, you inject it into mice, neonatal mice, newborn mice, or any guinea pig and so on. And then you wait. Basically, that's how viruses were isolated in the old days. And today, in 1 hour, you do a PCR, and you know what it is or not. So we just did our job. I mean, I was in training then in virology. As part of my training, I did a combination of clinical infectious diseases and a PhD in microbiology. But my PhD was actually all in bacteria, to be honest, not in viruses. But I kept an open mind, and I wanted to know about viruses. And so, we isolate the virus by accident. And so when we saw what's called a cytopathic effect, so then when the cells start dying, you think either it's toxicity or it's an infectious agent. And so you transfer the fluid containing viruses probably to another cell line, and if you see the same thing, then it's probably an infectious agent. But what we did have was an electron microscope. And so we could look at it under the electron microscope, and what we saw was looked like spaghetti or filaments, Most viruses are actually spheres or square type of particles. And then there was a bit of panic because, again, for the younger generation, we had to go to the library and to look and to open an atlas, and because we couldn't Google or whatever. Because this was something we had never seen. But for me, that was irrelevant because I was totally green in the lab. But the professor I worked with, they were very experienced virologists. And then it looked like Marburg virus. Marburg is a town in Germany, as you know, but that had experienced a deadly epidemic among workers in a polio vaccine plant. And they had been infected with Marburg virus that had contaminated green monkey kidney virus, kidney cells that are used to grow polio virus. And then we got a telegram from the World Health Organization. This all sounds like the Stone Age, but there were no mobile phones or nothing. So that we should immediately stop this work and transfer all our materials to the US, to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, in Georgia, which then was the only civil laboratory that was equipped to work with so-called Category 4, BSL-4 type of pathogens. And Ebola is one of them. There's one here in Portendown, but in these days it was a purely military laboratory. Now you have a civil and a military component. It's part of Public Health England. So we shipped the whole thing. Well, we packed it carefully, and it was then by something like DHL or whatever. It was the courier of the day. You will literally can go to jail if you would do that today. I'm not recommending it. So I consider this that we were lucky because But also the absence of bad luck is probably the most important thing in life, in the sense that we were dealing with this in what, for those of you who work in a lab, BSL 2.5, something like that. There was laminar flow and all that, but that's it. So easily some of us could have become infected. Now, the most exciting thing for me was that I had the opportunity to go to what was then called Zaire, as I said, to see what the epidemic was, what was going on. And there I was lucky again, because they were looking for volunteers to go, but they couldn't find that many. And I had never been to Africa in my life, and I had never investigated an epidemic, so I was definitely not qualified whatsoever. But, by lack of, I was a default option. But was very fortunate to work then with experienced Congolese colleagues, and some Americans from the Centers for Disease Control, and someone from Institut Pasteur. And that's how I ended up in a place called Yambuku. It was a Flemish Catholic mission, and they had a cooperative and a school and a hospital and so on. And when we arrived, 11 out of 17 hospital staff had died from this epidemic, and it was real panic. And among the sisters, they had lost 4 colleagues, and so on. And our mission was to stop the epidemic. It's a big word. Take care of the patients, and figure out how the virus is transmitted. Because in order to control an epidemic, you need to know how is it transmitted. Is it mosquitoes? Something very well. Insects, water, sex, airborne, direct contact, blood. The usual ways of transmission of pathogens in humans. And that was the biggest challenge for us to find out, and that was the job.
We come back to Ebola a little bit later, because it hasn't gone away.
No, it's keeping me very busy these days.
And Peter was just sending emails about it again. But then after the Ebola, he went on, obviously with various other things, moved on to AIDS research in the 1980s, and participated in one of the first international AIDS project in Africa, in Zaire again, but other countries too. And that's, I think, a particularly interesting period also in the book that I can highly recommend. Is he moved much more into the sphere of politics and bureaucracy that often affects how we can respond to crisis, but also do science. So he was the president of the International AIDS Society from 1991 to 94. And then in 94 he became the first director of the UN AIDS program, the first joint United Nations program on HIV/AIDS, and in that role also was Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. So that's of course a very, very, very high level of responsibility, and I'm pretty sure. So from that period of working for UN/AIDS and in that role, what would be the 1 or 2 most important lessons that you have learned?
First, that life is unpredictable. If before anybody would have told me, you'll be a UN bureaucrat, I probably, I'm a very peaceful person. I wouldn't hit you, but I would be very upset. This is not in my career path or my dreams. But when this new program in the UN was established, and I saw who what the shortlist was to become head of it, I said they know nothing about AIDS. So and so I said, okay, I'll take my chances. And to my big surprise, I was selected. I had never worked in the UN or in any government service or so.
But it was actually a pretty political election process, I think. Yeah?
Very political, and these appointments are very political. And so I had to, to make sure that some countries would support me and so on. And to my big surprise, I was selected and appointed. And it was the first time ever I came into the UN building in New York was during my interview. So I was absolutely not very, familiar with it. But But I was lucky also in the sense that I have a fantastic boss. It was Kofi Annan. I reported directly to him, and he was a very demanding boss, very tough, but also very caring, and he protected me when I would do my principle was I do and then I apologize later, and I ask for forgiveness, and because I was there because I wanted to do something about AIDS, and not for a career in the UN. So and my objectives were, I had 3 objectives. One was to put AIDS on the world's agenda, so that there would be the resources that we could break through the stigma, the discrimination, and so that was one thing, because I thought without that we can't do all the rest. And secondly was to organize in as many countries as possible AIDS programs that would not only promote and organize prevention, how to avoid that you're infected, but also bring down the price of antiretrovirals. So this I started in '95, and then in '96, again was luck. In actually exactly around this time, in July '96, it was announced at a conference in Vancouver that you can treat HIV infection. Until then, it was uniformly a death sentence. And I was seeing patients and so on, and all my patients died, all of them. And they were about of my age. It was not so, I mean, it was quite a challenge to do that. And then it was shown, thanks to research, investments from pharma and all that, if you give 3 drugs, you can treat. It's not a cure, but you can treat. The problem was that it was too expensive for most people in the world, about $14,000 per person per year. It was announced in July in Vancouver. In September, the National Health Service offered it to people living with HIV in this country, like most European countries. But millions and millions of people were infected with HIV in low-income countries, or in countries, or like in the US, where there is no universal health coverage. It's basically the same problem. Collectively, let's not forget, 75 million people have become infected with HIV. 35 million have died. It's the biggest epidemic of modern times since the Spanish flu. So I became obsessed by bringing down the price of these drugs so that it could be made available for people in need. And that took about 10 years. 10 years before 1 million Africans had access to it.
10 years?
Yes, and it was 96 was, got on the market, September 96. And the prices started going down in 2001, 2002, but still too high. But even if the price comes down, someone has to pay for it. So we had to do a lot of things, create a funding mechanism, financial mechanism. There's the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, so also for malaria and TB. President Bush took everybody by surprise to ask US Congress for $15 billion. I was always thinking 100 million more or so, and I was very happy. Here comes the president of the most powerful country in the world, 15 billion. We had to change intellectual property law so that it's possible for generic products, because the Indian generic manufacturers came on the market around the millennium, but that would be a violation of the TRIPS agreements that are part of the World Trade Organization. I mean, you must know this also very well for, plant useful products. And on the one hand, I didn't want to kill innovation and initiatives were, often driven by market incentives and intellectual property protection. On the other hand, people are dying because they have no access to it. So we came to a compromise that for low-income countries, that generic products can be imported from India, basically, and that's at about 5% of the cost of the same product in a high-income country. And that started work in 2003, 2004, but it took as I said, it was in 2006 that 1 million Africans had access to it. And today there are over 20 million people who are taking these drugs, but the generic version. And for a big pharma, for pharmaceutical companies, there's always the high-income country market. So that's the, well, I once quoted, said in that, thanks God there is AIDS in America and in Europe. And I regretted that I said it, but I said it again. But no, but what did I mean by that? There is a global market. If you have something like malaria or so, you know, that's only in poorer countries, that's a very different situation. And so there's still new drugs are being developed for high-income countries, and today automatically the same drugs are being made available at much lower cost. And then the third thing I try to do is to bring people with HIV at the table. I always thought that nothing for the people without the people, that's kind of a slogan, but that you know best what to do if you talk to people, if you involve them. It's like, you know, you develop products for agriculture. It's like if you would, you know, develop them in your lab or in a company and so on, and never ever talk to a farmer. And never, I mean, you have to understand what the consumer, what the actor, with the people whose lives it depends, what they, you know, what's important for them, because you'll do a better job. And plus, for me, it was a matter also of respect of human rights, because there was so much discrimination. Sorry for a long report.
No, it's great. I'm sure we'll touch on some of these things again later too. So then later on, so had a short stint at the Institute of Global Health at Imperial College as a director, and then in September 2010 became the director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where still the current director. So Peter is, of course, also a member of many prestigious science societies. He has, according to Wikipedia, if this is correct, authored something like 16 books and over 550 scientific articles. And of course, he has received a very long string of very, very impressive rewards, which I will not recite because it might embarrass him too much.
Thank you. Yeah, I hate it when they introduce me.
So, but what I want to do next is a little interactive session with Lucy's help, because if we want to talk about some of the sort of big issues that we face in the world, be it in the human sector or be it in the food sector or in the environment sector, I think it's always important to know how serious they are, and I think perceptions can also be very interesting there. So we have a Slido thing there for all of those who brought their smartphones and have Slido. I don't know how this works, Lucy. What is she saying? Okay, so she's saying to go to Slido and immediately answer the first question, which is, where does the majority of the world population live? You have three choices. This is from the Gapminder test. Yeah. So we'll wait for a few answers to come in here, so you can see the majority thinks in low-income countries. We got 70%, 21 now in middle income. Nobody thinks that the majority lives in high-income countries. So it's already a good sign.
However.
So, okay, we'll wait a little bit for this result to develop further here. Don't know. Is this the second counter up there? So we're supposed to give each question a maximum of 45 seconds to think about. So, but since you've been slow in picking up your smartphones, we'll wait a little. Okay, it looks like we're stabilizing. Around 3/4 of you are convinced that the majority lives in low-income countries, and the quarter in middle-income countries. Roughly speaking, it's fluctuating a bit. Okay. Now, can we move to the next question?
When will we give the...
We'll get the answers soon,
okay.
just to be a little patient.
I don't have...
So the next one is, there are 2 billion children in the world today, aged 0 to 15 years old. How many children will there be in the year 2100, according to the UN? Oh yeah, this is wildly fluctuating here. You got to get a bit more of a mixture here in voting. So... Oh, yeah, okay, so this is not yet quite clear yet. So, oh, yeah. So, okay, so the 3 billion is moving up a little, but okay, so we seem to be sort of half a few, 4 billion, a third, 3 billion, and the minority 2 billion. Okay, so 4 billion is the winner here. Let's move to the last question. How many of the world's 1-year-old children today have been vaccinated against some disease? Well, that's a tricky one. Okay, so for some reason people always seem to prefer the first choice given, yeah, in all of the okay, so all right, so we've got about half of you thinking 50%, 20% think, gets 36%, 80%, 16%. Now, I think we can now move to reveal the answers to show you that the majority of you have been wrong. Yeah. So, this is the answer to the first question. The majority of the world's population live in middle-income countries.
Think of China and India.
Not in low-income countries.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the next question, there are 2 billion children around, and yes, they're actually only going to be 2 billion if the UN is right in their predictions. So it is not going to double, as half of you have thought, and it's also not going to increase to 3 billion if these projections are correct, roughly speaking. And the last question, you will be surprised that 80% are in fact vaccinated. Yeah, so that received the lowest proportion of votes. So what this tells you, there are 10 more questions in the Gapminder test, so you can go to gapminder.org to do them all. I did them very quickly on Friday just to recheck myself. I got 10 out of 13 right. I was disappointed that I messed up 3. So, but what they tell us is that our perceptions of the progress that has been made already in combating some of these problems tend to be a little bit wrong, sometimes very wrong, In my view, yes, there are huge global issues, but we've also, I think, made some good progress in some of them, and that sometimes gets a little bit forgotten about, In your area, when you look at the sort of issues that we faced maybe 30 years ago or 20 years ago, do you feel there has been enough progress? And what are some of the big remaining challenges that we need to sort of tackle faster now?
Yeah, I would say there's never enough progress, but there's major progress. When you look at the facts are there that we've never been as healthy and lived as long as today in history. And in our, let's say, public health and the health sphere, we tend to emphasize everything that goes wrong, like in the media. But we've never lived that so long. I mean, even in the low-income countries, people now live as long as we lived here, let's say, in the 1930s and 40s. So that's amazing. The most infectious diseases in most continents, except for sub-Saharan Africa, people no longer die in the first place from infectious diseases. And so even, we mentioned AIDS, it's not over yet, and every year there's still, last year, about 800,000 people who died from AIDS, but that comes from 2.5 million a few years ago. Under 5 mortality has been more than halved. 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, over 100, now I have to think what I'm going to say, 10 million children died. I'm very bad at figures. And we're now at 4 million. Maternal mortality has gone down and so on. The problem is that it's very patchy. So one, there is sub-Saharan Africa. The poorest countries have the biggest problem. Also countries in conflict. And within countries, like middle-income countries includes now India. Now there are, you have people who have the same lifestyle and income and so on and opportunities as middle class here in the UK or more. And then others, you have still people who are living on less than $1.25 a day. China has made a most spectacular advance, in terms of lifting people out of extreme poverty. Unprecedented. So, good progress overall, education levels and all that. However, what we're seeing is that there's also another equalizer in a sense in the world, and that is that particularly in middle-income countries, but also more low-income countries, the disease patterns are now more and more similar like in the West. Diabetes is becoming a huge issue in China, in India and so on, just as it is in the UK. It's one of the big burdens on people, but also on the NHS. So chronic diseases in general, linked with what you call lifestyle, but it's not only individual choice. We see dementia as a big issue that's coming up, and that is to a large extent linked to the fact that we live longer. But most of the people with dementia will be in countries like in Asia. And then something that we tend to miss, and that is that the world's population is still increasing. There's no doubt about it. But it's driven by, in the first place, by sub-Saharan Africa. But in many parts of the world, the population is actually going down. Take China, and anything that goes on in China has a major impact on the rest of the world. I'm not even mentioning Japan, where the population goes down by a few 100,000 a year, or in Russia. So that explains what you saw there, that there will be only 2 billion children by 1200 and or 2100. That's probably fairly accurate. These demographic projections are up to now being quite accurate. So there is there's a big shift, and then what's coming in addition is the impact of environmental degradation, climate change, urbanization, and so on. So that is something that is, I think, that is fairly new, and is an area where I think what you're working on, and what we in human health are working on, where we also should come far more together. Last month or 2 months ago at our school, we founded the Center on Climate Change and Planetary Health. And it's brought together several groups in the school who worked on urbanization, food security, biodiversity, and impact of the environment and climate change. And they're also related, because the biggest impact of climate change on health will most probably not the spread of mosquitoes, of Aedes and so on for the amateurs here, but on indirect through food security. That's probably. So we're facing with far more complex issues than before. And the old days, let's say, what my special infectious diseases, you have an infection, you develop a vaccine, you have an antibiotic or an antiviral drug, and hygiene and so on, and you fix it. What we're facing today in terms of health is a lot to do with behavior, with commercial interests, with economics, and so on. And hence we have, our social scientist group has grown more than probably any other discipline in our school because of that.
So if we have these more complex and intertwined issues nowadays that are also more difficult to tackle, So one question that bugs me a lot based on own experience, but you have the same experience, I think, is that why does it always require having a crisis until people act, And I want to read a little clip here that I just picked up in The Guardian on Saturday, so because it goes back to Ebola. So The head of the World Health Organization has called the world's second worst Ebola outbreak a global wake-up call to the escalating risk of disease outbreaks spreading from conflict areas neglected by the international community. Only when there was fear and panic in the headlines did the international community respond, said Tedros Ghebreyesus. Donors refrain from paying until there is fear and panic. That has to change. We should not be funding by huge amounts when we panic, but should be funding to avoid panic. He said that international health systems in an increasingly globalized world were only as strong as the weakest link. And I think we experience very much the same in the agricultural sector, with there's also diseases and insects and other things that get spread. But even when it comes to food security, I remember in 2008, I was the Deputy Director General of the International Rice Research Institute, right at the time when the global rice price hit. So essentially over a period of 4 weeks, the world market price for rice tripled or quadrupled. Wow. So that led to massive media coverage. All of the TV stations in the world came to us. Over a couple of weeks, we had 3 front-page stories in the New York Times. And a year later, everything was forgotten. Yep. And we were scrambling for money again. So how do we get around this problem? How do we keep these things up on the agenda of the priority list of those in the public attention span that is so short nowadays? Are there better mechanisms to support these things, to solve these types of problems?
Yeah, no, I think that's the reality of the day. I'm not sure whether it has ever been different, but today it's exacerbated by a culture of short-termism, short attention span, and social media and all that, so that's the way it is. Indeed, for Ebola, and it's keeping me literally awake at night at the moment, because it is happening in an area where there is armed conflict, mistrust of government, where it's overpopulated, and where we have a corrupt government in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, so accountability is not so great, let's put it that way, and everybody's trying to have a bit of a piece of the pie. So that means it's not a technical issue. And I agree with Tedros, by the way, who's an alumnus from our school, the Director General of WHO. And he, so 2 things. One, in terms of epidemics, and then I'll come back to the more general issue. You cannot prevent the beginning of an outbreak. And like in Ebola, why do we have that? It's because Ebola virus lives very happily in certain species of bats. Bats are fascinating animals with completely different immune systems. They don't develop cancer, for example. They are the host of quite a few viruses that when they infect a human being, a human primate like us, then they are causing enormous damage, and that's why we're not a good host for it. And so you can't prevent that. People will be infected accidentally. What we can prevent is that it emerges into an epidemic, and that's where you need systems. This is what Tedros alludes to, for early diagnosis, for contact tracing, vaccines, and so on and so on. But in general, I would say to your question is something that really keeps me very, very busy. And I think that we're seeing it with the AIDS epidemic. People are no longer dying, so it's no news. And so there's complacency and so on. But I think that's why we need 2 things, or many things, but we need systems in place, institutions that are speaking up, advocating for a certain issue. Secondly, we as scientists, we have an important responsibility of, what they call public engagement, which I never really understood what it means, but we need to communicate. We shouldn't be just content that we publish a paper, even if it's in Nature or Science or so. But we need to talk to people, we need to communicate without promising the moon, and because we found a new receptor on the cell X that we say we have the cure for cancer. That's the other extreme. But we need to really engage with those who are in government, in parliament, the public at large, and it's something that you can learn, and that's for me an essential part of science and of what we do, and that's one way we can contribute to put it on the agenda. But for issues like AIDS, it took a deliberate strategy to put it on the world's agenda. Now there is a lot of competition, there's a lot of advocacy of groups, and a risk is that what we're seeing today is a world of micro self-identities. And we have been reading a lot about identities, politics. And one thing is, it happens, my wife works a lot on that, Heidi Larsson, that's on vaccine confidence. Why do we have measles epidemics these days? In the 21st century, why are people refusing to have their kids vaccinated against infections that can cause blindness, encephalitis, and so on? I mean, this has saved millions of lives. And so we've come to a stage in our societal development where there is an anti-science or sometimes anti-authority or whatever it is. But often it is about these identity groups, and we see that in politics and all that. And so for me, we need to invest in the science of that and see how can we deal with that, because I don't know how to deal with it. And so no direct answer to your question, but it is a real issue. And I'm sure, you know, when there is a drought or a famine, okay, food security is on the agenda. 2 months later, forgotten.
Usually lasts, and here's a food security a few years,
yeah,
and then it gets dropped again, and so you get the next crisis. Typically, every 5 to 10 years, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. And also, it's much more expensive to only react to the crisis. It's more expensive often than to invest in crisis prevention. Yeah. But where are the budgets for that? It's not so easy.
Yeah. Okay, at this point, I would like to open it for some questions. And we've got Asma there with a microphone, and then Cara down here. So Jonathan, up there. No, Asma's got one there. So,
So this is really interesting. I find myself agreeing immensely with a lot of what you say. I mean, I'm interested in nutritional enhancement, if you like, of foods. And a slide that I always talk about is talking about the prevalence of type 2 diabetes, which, you know, according to WHO, I'm sure you well know, is now something at 1 in 11 people on the planet have type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
You know, if that's not a crisis, I don't know what is. Yet it seems to be that it's completely, so it means that everybody must know somebody who has type 2 diabetes. In the UK, the projection is that 30% of the population by 2030 will have type 2 diabetes. I mean, if that's not an epidemic that's going to have a massive impact on society, both at the personal level and at the, healthcare provision and just general economics, I don't know what is. Yet it seems to me that people would rather worry about Love Island or something like that, or than worry about that. And maybe that's just a displacement activity. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I don't know how to bring these things to the agenda more clearly, more strongly. I mean, there must be a way of doing that. But I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are, because it's frustrating beyond belief.
I think it's possible to do it. I mean, I agree with you, that's an epidemic. 2 years ago, I was in Davos at the World Economic Forum, and every day I gave a half hour against a map of the world as bigger than this wall, and showing how viruses spread. It's quite cool. And then I had the mystery virus, basically, the last one, and you saw something spreading. And I asked, what is it? Nobody guessed it. It was diabetes. You can see how over the last 20 years or something like that it really took over, and it's still growing. So it is, but when I say it's possible to put it on the agenda, because it's been, possible to do it for other things. And you could also argue like mental health. It doesn't spread like that. It's been there already, but it's a huge problem that's hidden and stigma and all that. So there are a few countries now that are taking it on. The worst affected countries are in the Middle East, the Gulf, the Pacific Islands, now also it's in Asia, Brazil also. And but then you take, small city-state, Singapore. There's the Prime Minister himself has declared war on diabetes. And there is a societal-wide effort. If you leave this to the doctors and to the Ministry of Health, it won't work. We're there to provide let's say, the technical ammunition and, and maybe better treatments and so on. That's where, research is important. But certain things like diabetes, you need to tackle on really a society-wide level. And as you say, it's in our interest. I mean, every family must have someone with these statistics. So I think here in the UK, it's the fastest growing problem for the NHS. I can't remember the cost. The daily cost of diabetes is enormous.
18 billion a year.
Right. Yes. Yeah, we can also have a session on Brexit, but maybe next time. No, but that's so. I think that, and again, I think that's maybe what people working on diabetes can get together and so on. And so there are ways of doing it. I mean, it's like if you can have people vote for Brexit, you can also maybe use the same techniques to to come up with a movement for something that is positive. But it has to, one of the things I've learned, I started as a scientist, and is that without the policy and politics, you can't really achieve change and better lives in society. That, and No Time to Lose is a lot about that.
Yeah.
I wish I had understood all that when I started, but anyway, Yeah.
You learn by doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So more questions. And by the way, if the colleagues who listen in from Norsvik have a question, you just shout out loud in the background there. Yeah.
Thank you. So you mentioned the impact of failed states on emerging epidemics. So I suppose the first part of the question is, are these failed states increasing at the moment, and are they likely to increase further with climate change? I suppose the second question with the current Ebola epidemic is, has the vaccine, I'm not sure whether how effective the vaccine is, has that encouraged a complacency in the West with a new Ebola outbreak?
Yeah, I don't know the failed states. There are. I'm not sure that they have increased, but what I think there are quite a few scenarios that show that, or suggest, let's put it that way, that climate change and drought and the fight for water and all that will really contribute to destabilization of societies, migration and so on. When you look, I'm quite interested in history, so if you look at how did some of the big empires and kingdoms and so on perish, it was often because of that, of a climate issue, of an epidemic. So we'll see. But the vaccine, so there is, at the moment, there's a vaccine made by Merck, and it's for the amateurs, it's a life attenuated vaccine, and RVSV, vesicular virus, engineered virus, vaccine, sorry, and that's being used as a ring vaccination. So what the principle is, I've got Ebola, everybody who was in, I had lunch with the 12 or whatever, 10 postdocs and so on, everybody would then be vaccinated as ring vaccination. And that's been proven in a trial in Guinea, in West Africa in 2015, to protect and to be very, very effective. That's being used. The problem is there are only like 250, 300,000 doses available. There's a second vaccine available, made by J&J, by Johnson & Johnson, and that's an adenovirus, Adeno 26 vector, with a boost vaccine, and that has 4 antigens, so it protects against the different strains of Ebola plus Marburg, but it requires 2 injections. That's a downside. But that has not been used yet. It's been studied, and it was too late to be evaluated during an epidemic. In theory, it could be evaluated now, but ethically, you can't just, you can't randomize, half of the population, give them a ring vaccination with X and with Merck, and the other half with the other one. But it is being used now more and more for primary prevention. So healthcare workers, it should protect for a long time. Has it led to complacency? I'm not so sure. I think the fact that the epidemic in DRC is not the front pages because it's, Congo is kind of a basket case, hopeless. They don't speak English, and also, I mean, in terms of the attention, in West Africa with Sierra Leone, with UK has quite a long link with it. There were cases, there was a nurse here, and so on. But it may change. There was a case in Goma, a big city, yesterday, and today there's a big meeting in Geneva. So we'll see. I think it's not just a matter of money, but a matter of involving communities and talking to people was one of the big lessons from West Africa, and that seemed to have forgotten. So we need to work with people, particularly in an environment where there's so much paranoia, and people have suffered so much from war, from a genocide and all that, and that we also have to deploy the second vaccine on a massive basis, because Johnson & Johnson has offered 1.5 million doses for free. Because this is also another issue, since you're in research, a silver lining of the West Africa Ebola epidemic that killed 11,000 people is that it led to the establishment of what's called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. What is it? Vaccines or drugs for diseases like Ebola, there is no market incentive. You're not going to make money with that whatsoever. And so we put together a coalition and with public funders and private funders, and to stimulate the development of vaccines, in this case, against infections and diseases that are epidemic, Lassa, Ebola, Nipah, there's a few others, and because it's industry that makes the vaccines, but the shareholders are not so keen for doing that, and you can't blame them. It's kind of incredible that both Merck and J&J have done this time for Ebola, but you can't expect them to do that every time. So there are mechanisms to do that, and maybe in your field there are also similarities. I don't know, because particularly with biotech, so I'm very interested I'm very involved in biotech and so on. So when you see the potential that's there, and but in our field, it's nearly all going to rare diseases and in oncology and cancer. That's where you can make money.
Yeah, I think it's similar in the agricultural sector in the sense that the big investments in biotechnology go into the big commercial crops that are grown in countries where there's a big seed crop market, if you wish.
Yeah.
So, and this is not Africa, But that kind of leads me to another question, kind of related. I'm coming from the back door there. Nature had an interesting news feature last week, which I thought was actually quite thoughtful. It was titled "Self-Destructing Mosquitoes and Sterilized Rodents: The Promise of Gene Drives." So that's an area that we have a strong interest in, the agricultural sector, in the human biology sector, health sector. And of course, we could imagine, to manipulate the bat population in the Ebola outbreak areas so that we don't have those viruses anymore there. A lot of things seem to be possible with genome editing and gene drive technologies, but of course the ethical proportions, whatever the regulatory aspects are, in some ways one might fear that they might prevent us from ever being able to use these types of approaches. Or do you feel that there is hope for that?
Well,
some of these
I studied medicine in Ghent, which is one of the places where GMOs, were the first, agrobacterium tumefacients transfer tobacco plants was done, and so that's how plant technology is there. And yet, in the country and in much of continental Europe, there's total paranoia about GM crops and organisms in general. And there, I've always wondered, I've been speaking about this to the public, and I don't think the issue is that people don't understand enough. We as scientists, we think, oh, they don't understand, we need to give more information. And that is part of it, of course, but we need to think always and try to understand what's behind this, why. Why? In Germany, for example, anything that has the word genetic in there is like there's paranoia about it because of the past. Then eugenics and so on. And but we must really be very, how to say, communicate, try to understand, but also pick out where we can go. For example, the fact that some of the GM seeds and crops have this killer gene, and then that a farmer has to buy every time the new one. So that's what I was told. So in developing countries, poor farmers, that's not so great.
I would actually argue that if you want to make farmers grow poor seeds, that's your strategy. So I think you're actually actively preventing them from access to high-quality seeds.
Yes.
Hybrids are a normal part of a farmer's business. Yeah. So I think it's actually exactly the opposite effect that it has on the farmer. Yeah. So you're preventing access to advances in genetics.
No, but I'm with you. But I just trying to understand why the resistance is there, and that's an issue. So then. But when you take, for example, the new technologies, so the fact this with CRISPR-9 technology been applied to these babies in Shenzhen in China, that, which was totally irresponsible and not even necessary. I mean, from a medical perspective, there was actually no point. We have very efficient ways of preventing the transmission of mother to child of HIV. That was where you can just give some drugs and that's it. But that kind of things can have enormous negative consequences, because that's then on the front pages, and then it's all, throw away baby with the bathwater. But I think we need to just explore, we need to go, we need to invest, it would also be unethical from my perspective not to use the, the best of science for better life. That's the issue that we're getting now in human medicine is the cost of all this. So there are more and more like precision medicine, therapies for rare diseases, for some of the genetic disorders, but also for certain subsets of cancer that can be cured by, let's say, particularly it's immunotherapy these days. But that costs now up to $2 million. And a company can say, okay, but you gain a whole life, and that is worth so much. But then who can afford that? And insurance companies in the US are now getting, in trouble. The NHS has already enough problems. So how to deal with that? That is for me. That's one of the big debates. I think you probably have that less, because in agriculture, I guess it's by definition always a mass market, isn't it?
More or less.
More or less, yeah.
Good. I'm suggesting that we go on for a little bit more. But I obviously recognize that some of you may have other meetings planned. I won't be offended if anybody needs to leave the room. Just any more questions, please? Okay, well, can Asma, can you? Oh no, Kara's got it. Kara's got it. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. Just as I attend a number of these meetings and listen to a number of these very interesting conversations by men and women in science, the more I, and this might be slightly controversial in this room, the more I start to think it's got less and less to do with science and more to do with philosophy, in that, you know, we see, for example, the stat, you know, we have 1 billion children now and we'll have 1 billion children at the end of the century, but I don't know, how do we view children within our society? You know, before coming here, I was listening to a talk on the Democratic candidates are talking about health care in the States, and some of the big questions coming out of that are, you know, how do we view our society? You know, how do we view the most vulnerable in our society? In relation to AIDS, you know, this isn't a predominantly European issue, and it benefited because at times it was European, where I can empathize with you saying thank goodness Americans and Europeans had AIDS. So maybe just from your experience, your thoughts on the philosophical side of, as a scientist and as we all are sort of scientists, how are we sort of viewing these issues as a species and as societies?
Well, my view is when science is driven, I mean, curiosity is the mother of science. That's why we want to know and so on, and also the urge to improve life or whatever we do, or have better machines or so on. So that's one aspect of it. On the other hand, when you look at scientists and institutes for research and all that, traditionally in society have a broader role than the specific issue. When you work on agriculture and so on, and food security, there is no way you can escape from political and you can call it philosophical questions. And some scientists don't like that, and that's fine. I mean, that's their right. But I think that through our work, which gives insight, and because we spend all this time on it, into issues that most people don't have the time or they haven't dealt with, you know, in terms of their training, that I think it's our responsibility to also think about that. I mean, there are my son's girlfriend studies philosophy of physics in Oxford. I didn't even know that it existed. And then she told me, okay, and then I started, oh yeah, indeed, but that was a fairly esoteric type of aspect of compared to what you're saying. But I think it is, we have a social responsibility. Also, we work with taxpayers' money, a lot of us, and so, you know, so we have to give back to society. Now, do people like to hear what we say? The answer is often no. And look at the whole debate on climate change. The fact that there's still debate, or that you have a president, you know, like Trump and so on, and even questioning it, that is sobering. You can say, I mean, do we have to waste our time with this? But yet it means that we need to build a case, to present the evidence, but also to think what are the consequences of our work. For example, there's a big debate on today, a historic debate, eugenetics and so on, and this whole movement that was kind of quote unquote normal, you know, in the 100 years ago, and now at UCL there is a whole debate: should we take away the names of certain professors who were big stars in their field, but were clearly racist or were, you know, etc., etc. How do you deal with that? They were involved in philosophical and political issues of their time, but today we definitely feel that I was wrong. So I think we need to take time to think about, and what I try to do is to read outside my own field. And when you mention nature, that means the first, I don't pretend I understand 1% of what's in the second half of nature, what's in the published in there. But the first half, there's a lot of reflective type of articles and so on. So you don't have to go too far, but it's good to read also about all these issues. And for example, one of the big misconceptions is that it is about population growth. I mean, it's very diverse. And the biggest problem that most of the world will be confronted with is a shrinking of the workforce and of the population and the dependency ratio. So older people, no younger people. Not in sub-Saharan Africa. But when you start thinking about all the implications for that, that's quite something. What can we contribute to that? What can you work in agriculture and food? What is, when you take the 20, 50-year perspective, what is it? And one thing that I've learned also is that both in research and in innovation and development, like if you have a company, how long it takes between Eureka, the great idea, and that someone or something is there that, the result of it can be, in our field, it's 10 to 20 years.
Now it's in agriculture the same?
It's the same, yeah. If you're in Silicon Valley, you develop a new app, and then you put it on the market, it works, it doesn't work, you start anything else. But we have regulation. We have consequences, exactly. So, plus demonstrating that something works, it's, some of the great statistical methods to demonstrate that something works or doesn't work were developed here. And some of that at our school, the randomized controlled trial came from us. And so this is this time to think about the consequences. Also in my field, for example, when there's a new development, new drug, new vaccine, you need to think already about how are we going to make sure that people benefit from that way before it is on the, reaching the market. But that's a hard sell. But companies do that more and more now. Yeah.
When my daughter had read your book, she had two questions that she asked me to ask you.
Oh.
So one is, were you ever scared by what you were doing? And the other one is, do you actually think that the things that you were able to do as a young scientist could still be done by scientists nowadays, or would our systems and science more or less actively prevent them from doing this?
Yeah, okay. On the first one, the answer is yes, I've been scared, but often, like with Ebola, I was scared particularly afterwards. No, I mean, I don't know how to say this, but because it was a new virus epidemic, first time in my life in Africa, so I was kind of euphoric in a sense, and it's the adrenaline of, you don't have time and all that, but you try not to be stupid, not to expose yourself, and then, and that's then the end. That's, but I was more scared perhaps a lot with the, when I was head of a UN institution and you had to deal with all these governments and big interests and so on, that's the pressure on you to conform to, well, the prevailing thinking and all that is enormous. Is really, that requires a lot of resilience not to break. So I understand politics and the politicians and the burden on them. And the second question was on, could have done. The answer is no. I could not have done in my young years what I did in the current system. I'm now talking about medical specialty training, PhD training. You have to deliver in, 4 years. You have to do this and that. I disappeared, as you say, described in the jungle, okay? It was not as dramatic, but still. There's this opportunity. I go, I spend time, 6 months, first 4 months in Congo, then I went back because there was a false alarm and I could go here and there. Today everything is so kind of administratively have to tick off all these boxes and so on. So I could negotiate, and frankly, I learned far more. This was particularly in the medical field, not in the PhDs. You have to do the experiments. I mean, mine was in lab science, and it was in these days. You so work on plasmids and on pathogenesis, and for the younger generation, it took me 3 months to sequence a 3 kilodalton small plasmid. So, and you have to repeat it all over again. I mean, this can be done by a robot in an hour now. But anyway,
yeah.
And
I do think it would be nice if science could be a bit more adventurous again. I disappeared into Russia for my PhD without a plan. So, and I came out and, had a lot of interesting things, but yeah.
Main lesson is don't plan your career too much.
Yeah, I think that's what
because
I agree with. Yeah.
Maybe it works, but
One last question. All right, we've got Amma here. So. Right there. So
in terms of the social sciences side, you were talking about the, I suppose, kind of the ethical implications of when you're designing something, how that's going to affect the populations that you're bringing it into. How early on do you get those social scientists involved, and how much of it do you think would be affected by political landscape or the kind of cultural or social attitudes of the actual people within that country?
Yeah, I would say that one of the things I'm really proud of for the London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine, which is such a long name, but is that there is a true culture of cross-disciplinary work. And that's one of the reasons that we can attract people from famous universities who want to come work with us, because the barriers between the walls between disciplines are fairly low. I mean, of course they exist, if only because of vocabulary. The same word means different things for different disciplines. And I'm mentioning that because you have to start with that, so that there is a culture of involving people from other disciplines. And when it comes to, for example, we do a lot of in infectious diseases, also product development. You go from discovery, but you have people who do clinical trials, you do people who think already about the economics, you have the social science. You have to do that when you try to work from end to end. You have to start thinking of that very early on, when the chance that there will be ever a product on the market is very, very small. But that's how you do it. And then on the other hand, you also, in the other direction, when we have all these people, over half of our staff is based in Africa. And people in the field, some of them work in labs and so on, pretty sophisticated labs. But when they encounter a problem, or a clinician a problem, or, they can easily call someone, in the lab, can you help us figure that out? Or a colleague, if they're not a social scientist, but a clinician, a social scientist, what do you think? How to do that? And then go for develop a joint research proposal and so on. But I think it requires a culture in the first place, but it's a culture that's the exception in the world. And maybe that's also a bit of an advantage that we're a relatively small institution compared to another complete university. We're only about half. And that so people are, I'm not saying everybody knows each other, because 3,000 is a lot, but that's easier than to do it in a big complete university where it's just unavoidable because people are in their disciplines and there's so many. But I think the openness is there. The problem that I see is I'm quite involved with what's called the Global Challenges Research Fund and some of the ODA-funded, Official Development Assistance-funded research. And one of the explicit goals is to promote cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary science. And bringing teams together that normally don't work together but have a common interest or work along a common goals. And that's working more and more because there's now funding source. The problem that we're facing is the review of it. Because we're all used to review in our specialty, using our criteria, and our value system. I mean, I'm not thinking about moral value system, but and how do you bring that together? We're not there yet, and that I think is something for where we need to think also in our education system. I mean, I particularly, you know, starting probably at undergraduate level.
Well, I think that's actually very fine thought to end this dialogue with. So the need to do more interdisciplinary work. So one can join us a bit more now if you want. We have another discussion, just more of a conversation about maybe also a bit more areas for collaboration or other things we can think of. Yeah. But I think it's been very interesting. I would like to all give Peter a big hand and thank him for coming here to Rothamsted today. Thank you very much. Thank you.